From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! We're broadcasting from Stanford, California. Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama hold their last debate before the Pennsylvania primary. We'll play highlights and speak with independent vice presidential candidate Matt Gonzalez. He's Ralph Nader's running mate. And a conversation with renowned Stanford law professor Lawrence Lessig on today's FCC hearing on net neutrality, Creative Commons, and his latest Change Congress project to take on corruption in Washington. All that and more coming up. Now, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. 20 Palestinians and 3 Israeli troops died on Wednesday in one of the bloodiest days in Gaza in weeks. Many of the Palestinians killed were civilians, including at least 5 youths under the age of 16. Among the dead was 23-year-old Fadel Shana, a cameraman for Reuters news agency. He was killed when an Israeli tank shell struck his clearly marked Jeep. Shana was filming at the time of his death. Reuters released the video from his camera. It shows the shell being fired from a distance, and then moments later, the camera goes black. Reuters editor-in-chief David Schlesinger called Shana's death tragic.
What's clear to me is that we need a thorough and immediate investigation by the Israeli Defense Forces into what happened. This is a tragic incident, one that really shows the risks that journalists take every day around the world. But all organizations, governments included, have an obligation to let professionals do their job without fear of death.
Danny Seaman, an Israeli government spokesperson, said the shooting of the journalist was not intentional and that Israel should not be blamed for what happened.
Life today of a Reuters photographer in Gaza is the direct result of the cynical behavior of the Hamas army. This army, which chooses to fire against Israeli civilians, also uses the Palestinian civilians as a shield.
In campaign news, ABC News is coming under intense criticism for its handling of last night's Democratic debate in Pennsylvania. It was the last before next week's primary. Media critic Greg Mitchell said it was, quote, perhaps the most embarrassing performance by the media in a major presidential debate in years. During the first 45 minutes of the debate, the moderators focused on Obama's comments that some voters in Pennsylvania were bitter, the Reverend Jeremiah Wright controversy, Clinton's Bosnia sniper fire story, flag pins, and the weather underground. We'll have more on the debate and play excerpts after headlines. In Iraq, the U.S. military has released Associated Press photographer Bilal Hussein after holding him without charge for 2 years. The military had once accused Hussein of being a, quote, terrorist media operative who infiltrated the AP. Upon his release, Hussein said, quote, I've spent 2 years in prison even though I was innocent. I thank everybody. The Committee to Protect Journalists praised the release of Hussein but condemned the U.S. treatment of journalists. Joel Simon, the group's executive director, said Hussein joins a growing list of journalists detained in conflict zones by the U.S. military. Simon said, quote, this deplorable practice should be of concern to all journalists. It basically allows the U.S. military to remove journalists from the field, lock them up, and never be compelled to say why. The U.S. is still imprisoning at least 2 other journalists without charge. Al Jazeera cameraman Sami al-Hajj is being held at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. He's been held for more than 5 years. And Jawad Ahmad, a journalist with Canada's CTV, is at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. Several states have announced plans to resume carrying out executions by lethal injection after a major Supreme Court ruling Wednesday. In a 7-2 decision, the court upheld Kentucky's method of execution by lethal injection. The court's decision effectively lifts a de facto moratorium on lethal injections. The decision came one day after Amnesty International named the United States one of the top 5 executioners in the world, along with China, Iran, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. On his second day in the United States, Pope Benedict XVI expressed deep shame over the priest's sexual abuse scandal and said Catholic bishops must work hard to bring Americans back into the church. At the White House, President Bush praised Pope Benedict's message.
In a world where some invoke the name of God to justify acts of terror and murder and hate, we need your message that God is love. And embracing this love is the surest way to save men from falling prey to the teaching of fanaticism and terrorism. In a world where some treat life as something to be debased and discarded, we need your message that all human life is sacred.
During his meeting with President Bush, Pope Benedict also discussed the treatment of Latino immigrants in the United States. The Pope said the U.S. must do everything possible to fight all forms of violence so that immigrants may lead dignified lives. While the Pope was in Washington, immigration agents were raiding plants run by the chicken processing company Pilgrim's Pride. 400 immigrant workers were detained. The raids occurred in Batesville, Arkansas, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Live Oak, Florida, Moorfield, West Virginia, and Mount Pleasant, Texas. It was the largest immigration roundup at a workplace this year. A group of liberal advocacy groups have launched a campaign calling for the resignation of Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice after ABC News revealed Rice personally oversaw meetings where top Bush administration officials selected specific torture techniques. As part of the campaign, a new TV ad has been produced by Brave New Films.
The United States doesn't and can't condone torture.
A major news outlet reported that the president's top advisors personally approved specific interrogation methods.
Top secret meetings were held in the White House.
It was a torture program and approved at the very highest level.
Rice personally told the CIA, "This is your baby. Go do it."
Torture and conspiracy to commit torture are crimes under U.S. law.
Meanwhile, the American Civil Liberties Union has announced it's obtained documents from the Pentagon confirming the military's use of unlawful interrogation methods on detainees held in U.S. custody in Afghanistan. The documents include the first on-the-ground reports of torture in Gardez, Afghanistan, to be publicly released. In Miami, federal prosecutors have been dealt another setback in a closely watched terrorism case. For the second time, a mistrial has been declared because of a deadlocked jury in the trial of 6 Miami men accused of providing material support to al-Qaeda to destroy FBI buildings and Chicago's Sears Tower. University of Miami law professor Bruce Winnick said, quote, "The jury doesn't trust the government's credibility here. It's a trumped-up, overblown case," he said. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami has until Wednesday to decide whether to seek a third trial. In news from Capitol Hill, the House has passed a bill that could lead to the cancellation of 24 developing nations, including Haiti, Kenya, Vietnam, and Georgia. The Jubilee Act directs the Bush administration to begin negotiations with international creditors to allow up to 24 nations to qualify for international debt relief. President Bush announced a new goal of stopping the growth of U.S. global warming emissions by 2025 by he offered few details on how this would be done. The goal falls far short of what is needed, according to many climate researchers. Last year, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded global emissions must peak no later than 2015 to prevent catastrophic effects of global warming. President Bush urged Congress not to pass any climate change legislation that demands immediate cuts in emissions.
I believe that congressional debate should be guided by certain core principles and a clear appreciation that there is a wrong way and a right way to approach reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Bad legislation would impose tremendous cost on our economy and on American families without accomplishing the important climate change goals we share. The wrong way is to raise taxes, duplicate mandates, or demand sudden and drastic emissions cuts that have no chance of being realized and every chance of hurting our economy.
Meanwhile, in Richmond, Virginia, 3 people were arrested this week while blocking the entrance of the headquarters of Dominion Power. The activists with Blue Ridge Earth First were protesting Dominion's plan to build no new coal-fired power plants. The Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv has reported Israel's former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has publicly said the September 11th attacks have been good for Israel. Netanyahu said, quote, "We're benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq." end quote. Netanyahu then reportedly said these events, quote, swung American public opinion in our favor.